This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. Chapter 12, on National Education. The good effects resulting from attention to private education will ever be very confined, and the parent who really puts his own hand to the plow will always in some degree be disappointed, till education becomes a grand national concern. A man cannot retire into a desert with his child, and if he did, he could not bring himself back to childhood, and become the proper friend and playfellow of an infant or youth. And when children are confined to the society of men and women, they very soon acquire that kind of premature manhood which stops the growth of every vigorous power of mind or body. In order to open their faculties, they should be excited to think for themselves, and this can only be done by mixing a number of children together and making them jointly pursue the same objects. A child very soon contracts a benumbing indolence of mind, which he has seldom sufficient vigor to shake off, when he only asks a question instead of seeking for information, and then relies implicitly on the answer he receives. With his equals in age this could never be the case, and the subjects of inquiry, though they might be influenced, would not be entirely under the direction of men, who frequently damp, if not destroy, abilities, by bringing them forward too hastily, and too hastily they will infallibly be brought forward if the child could be confined to the society of a man, however sagacious that man may be. Besides, in youth, the seeds of every affection should be sown, and the respectful regard, which is felt for a parent, is very different from the social affections that are to constitute the happiness of life as it advances. Of these, equality is the basis, and an intercourse of sentiments unclogged by that observant seriousness which prevents disputation, though it may not enforce submission. Let a child have ever such an affection for his parent, he will always languish to play and chat with children, and the very respect he entertains, for filial esteem always has a dash of fear mixed with it, will, if it do not teach him cunning, at least prevent him from pouring out the little secrets which first open the heart to friendship and confidence, gradually leading to more expansive benevolence. Added to this, he will never acquire that frank ingenuousness of behavior which young people can only attain by being frequently in society, where they dare to speak what they think, neither afraid of being reproved for their presumption, nor laughed at for their folly. Forcibly impressed by the reflections which the sight of schools, as they are at present conducted, naturally suggested, I have formerly delivered my opinion rather warmly in favor of a private education, but further experience has led me to view the subject in a different light. I still, however, think schools, as they are now regulated, the hotbeds of vice and folly, and the knowledge of human nature, supposed to be attained there, merely cunning selfishness. At school boys become gluttons and slovens, and, instead of cultivating domestic affections, very early rush into the libertinism which destroys the constitution before it is formed, hardening the heart as it weakens the understanding. I should, in fact, be averse to boarding schools, if it were for no other reason than the unsettled state of mind which the expectation of the vacations produce. On these the children's thoughts are fixed with eager anticipating hopes for, at least, to speak with moderation, half of the time, and when they arrive they are spent in total dissipation and beastly indulgence. But, on the contrary, when they are brought up at home, though they may pursue a plan of study in a more orderly manner than can be adopted, when near a fourth part of the year is actually spent in idleness, and as much more in regret and anticipation, yet they there acquire too high an opinion of their own importance, from being allowed to tyrannize over servants, and from the anxiety expressed by most mothers on the score of manners, who, eager to teach the accomplishments of a gentleman, stifle in their birth the virtues of a man. Thus brought into company when they ought to be seriously employed, and treated like men when they are still boys, they become vain and effeminate. The only way to avoid two extremes equally injurious to morality would be to contrive some way of combining a public and private education. Thus, to make men citizens, two natural steps might be taken, which seem directly to lead to the desired point. For the domestic affections that first open the heart to the various modifications of humanity would be cultivated, whilst the children were nevertheless allowed to spend great part of their time on terms of equality with other children. I still recollect with affection the country day school, where a boy trudged in the morning, wet or dry, carrying his books, and his dinner, if it were at a considerable distance. A servant did not then lead master by the hand, for, when he had once put on coat and breeches, he was allowed to shift for himself, and return alone in the evening to recount the feats of the day close at the parental knee. His father's house was his home, and was ever after fondly remembered. Nay, I appeal to some superior men who were educated in this manner, whether the recollection of some shady lane where they conned their lesson, or of some stile where they sat making a kite or mending a bat, has not endeared their country to them. But what boy ever recollected with pleasure the years he spent in close confinement at an academy near London, unless indeed he should by chance remember the poor scarecrow of an usher whom he tormented, or the tart man from whom he caught a cake, to devour it with the caddish appetite of selfishness. At boarding schools of every description, the relaxation of the junior boys is mischief, and of the senior, vice. Besides, in great schools, what can be more prejudicial to the moral character than the system of tyranny and abject slavery which is established amongst the boys, to say nothing of the slavery to forms, which makes religion worse than a farce? For what good can be expected from the youth who receives the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, to avoid forfeiting half a guinea, which he probably afterwards spends in some sensual manner? Half the employment of the youths is to elude the necessity of attending public worship, and well they may, for such a constant repetition of the same thing must be a very irksome restraint on their natural vivacity, as these ceremonies have the most fatal effect on their morals, and as a ritual performed by the lips, when the heart and mind are far away, is not now stored up by our Church as a bank to draw on for the fees of the poor souls in purgatory, why should they not be abolished? But the fear of innovation in this country extends to everything. This is only a covert fear, the apprehensive timidity of indolent slugs, who guard, by sliming it over, the snug place, which they consider in the light of an hereditary estate, and eat, drink, and enjoy themselves, instead of fulfilling the duties, excepting a few empty forms for which it was endowed. These are the people who most strenuously insist on the will of the Founder being observed, crying out against all reformation, as if it were a violation of justice. I am now alluding particularly to the relics of popery retained in our colleges, where the Protestant members appear to be such sticklers for the established Church. But their zeal never makes them lose sight of the spoil of ignorance, which rapacious priests of superstitious memory have scraped together. No, wise in their generation, they venerate the prescriptive right of possession as a stronghold, and still let the sluggish bell tingle to prayers, as during the days when the elevation of the host was supposed to atone for the sins of the people, lest one reformation should lead to another, and the spirit kill the letter. These Romish customs have the most baneful effect on the morals of our clergy, for the idle vermin who 2 or 3 times a day perform, in the most slovenly manner, a service which they think useless, but call their duty, soon lose a sense of duty. At college, forced to attend or evade public worship, they acquire an habitual contempt for the very service, the performance of which is to enable them to live in idleness. It is mumbled over as an affair of business, as a stupid boy repeats his task, and frequently the college cant escapes from the preacher the moment after he has left the pulpit, and even whilst he is eating the dinner which he earned in such a dishonest manner. Nothing, indeed, could be more irreverent than the cathedral service as it is now performed in this country. Neither does it contain a set of weaker men than those who are the slaves of this childish routine. A disgusting skeleton of the former state is still exhibited, but all the solemnity that interested the imagination, if it did not purify the heart, is stripped off. The performance of High Mass on the Continent must impress every mind, where a spark of fancy glows, with that awful melancholy, that sublime tenderness so near akin to devotion. I do not say that these devotional feelings are of more use in a moral sense than any other emotion of taste, but I contend that the theatrical pomp which gratifies our senses is to be preferred to the cold parade that insults the understanding without reaching the heart. Amongst remarks on national education, such observations cannot be misplaced, especially as the supporters of these establishments, degenerated into puerilities, affect to be the champions of religion. Religion, pure source of comfort in this vale of tears, how has thy clear stream been muddled by the dabblers, who have presumptuously endeavored to confine in one narrow channel the living waters that ever flow toward God, the sublime ocean of existence? What would be life without that peace which the love of God, when built on humanity, alone can impart? Every earthly affection turns back, at intervals, to prey upon the heart that feeds it, and the purest effusions of benevolence, often rudely damped by men, must mount as a free will offering to Him who gave them birth, whose bright image they faintly reflect. In public schools, however, religion, confounded with irksome ceremonies and unreasonable restraints, assumes the most ungracious aspect. Not the sober, austere one that commands respect while it inspires fear, but a ludicrous cast that serves to point a pun. For, in fact, most of the good stories and smart things which enliven the spirits that have been concentrated at whist are manufactured out of the incidents to which the very men labor to give a droll turn, who countenance the abuse, to live on the spoil. There is not, perhaps, in the kingdom a more dogmatical or luxurious set of men than the pedantic tyrants who reside in colleges and preside at public schools. The vacations are equally injurious to the morals of the masters and pupils, and the intercourse which the former keep up with the nobility introduces the same vanity and extravagance into their families, which banish domestic duties and comforts from the lordly mansion, whose state is awkwardly aped on a smaller scale. The boys who live at a great expense with the masters and assistants are never domesticated, though placed there for that purpose, for after a silent dinner they swallow a hasty glass of wine and retire to plan some mischievous trick, or to ridicule the person or manners of the very people they have just been cringing to, and whom they ought to consider as the representatives of their parents. Can it then be a matter of surprise that boys become selfish and vicious who are thus shut out from social converse, or that a mitre often graces the brow of one of these diligent pastors? The desire of living in the same style as the rank just above them infects each individual and every class of people, and meanness is the concomitant of this ignoble ambition. But those professions are most debasing whose latter is patronage. Yet out of one of these professions the tutors of youth are in general chosen. But can they be expected to inspire independent sentiments, whose conduct must be regulated by the cautious prudence that is ever on the watch for preferment? So far, however, from thinking of the morals of boys, I have heard several masters of schools argue that they only undertook to teach Latin and Greek, and that they had fulfilled their duty by sending some good scholars to college. A few good scholars, I grant, may have been formed by emulation and discipline, but to bring forward these clever boys, the health and morals of a number have been sacrificed. The sons of our gentry and wealthy commoners are mostly educated at these seminaries, and will any one pretend to assert that the majority, making every allowance, come under the description of tolerable scholars? It is not for the benefit of society that a few brilliant men should be brought forward at the expense of the multitude. It is true that great men seem to start up as great revolutions occur, at proper intervals, to restore order, and to blow aside the clouds that thicken over the face of truth. But let more reason and virtue prevail in society, and these strong winds would not be necessary. Public education of every denomination should be directed to form citizens, but if you wish to make good citizens, you must first exercise the affections of a son and a brother. This is the only way to expand the heart, for public affections as well as public virtues must ever grow out of the private character, or they are merely meteors that shoot athwart a dark sky and disappear as they are gazed at and admired. Few, I believe, have had much affection for mankind who did not first love their parents, their brothers, sisters, and even the domestic brutes whom they first played with. The exercise of youthful sympathies forms the moral temperature, and it is the recollection of these first affections and pursuits that gives life to those that are afterwards more under the direction of reason. In youth, the fondest friendships are formed. The genial juices mounting at the same time kindly mix, or rather the heart, tempered for the reception of friendship, is accustomed to seek for pleasure in something more noble than the churlish gratification of appetite. In order, then, to inspire a love of home and domestic pleasures, children ought to be educated at home, for riotous holidays only make them fond of home for their own sakes. Yet the vacations, which do not foster domestic affections, continually disturb the course of study, and render any plan of improvement abortive, which includes temperance. Still, were they abolished, children would be entirely separated from their parents, and I question whether they would become better citizens by sacrificing the preparatory affections, by destroying the force of relationships that render the marriage state as necessary as respectable. But if a private education produce self-importance, or insulates a man in his family, the evil is only shifted, not remedied. This train of reasoning brings me back to a subject on which I mean to dwell, the necessity of establishing proper day schools. These should be national establishments, for whilst schoolmasters are dependent on the caprice of parents, little exertion can be expected from them, more than is necessary to please ignorant people. Indeed, the necessity of a master's giving the parents some sample of the boy's abilities, which during the vacation is shown to every visitor, is productive of more mischief than would at first be supposed, for they are seldom done entirely, to speak with moderation, by the child itself. Thus the master countenances falsehoods, or winds the poor machine up to some extraordinary exertion that injures the wheels, and stops the progress of gradual improvement. The memory is loaded with unintelligible words to make a show of, without the understandings acquiring any distinct ideas. But only that education deserves emphatically to be termed cultivation of mind, which teaches young people how to begin to think. The imagination should not be allowed to debauch the understanding before it gains strength, or vanity will become the forerunner of vice. For every way of exhibiting the achievements of a child is injurious to its moral character. How much time is lost in teaching them to recite what they do not understand, whilst, seated on benches, all in their best array, the mammas listen with astonishment to the parrot-like prattle, uttered in solemn cadences, with all the pomp of ignorance and folly. Such exhibitions only serve to strike the spreading fibres of vanity through the whole mind, for they neither teach children to speak fluently nor behave gracefully. So far from it, that these frivolous pursuits might comprehensively be termed the study of affectation, for we now rarely see a simple, bashful boy, though few people of taste were ever disgusted by that awkward sheepishness so natural to the age, which schools and an early introduction into society have changed into impudence and apish grimace. Yet how can these things be remedied, whilst schoolmasters depend entirely on parents for a subsistence, and when so many rival schools hang out their lures to catch the attention of vain fathers and mothers, whose parental affection only leads them to wish that their children should outshine those of their neighbors? Without great good luck, a sensible, conscientious man would starve before he could raise a school, if he disdained to bubble weak parents, by practising the secret tricks of the craft. In the best regulated schools, however, where swarms are not crammed together, many bad habits must be acquired. But at common schools, the body, heart, and understanding are equally stunted, for parents are often only in quest of the cheapest school, and the master could not live if he did not take a much greater number than he could manage himself. Nor will this scanty pittance allowed for each child permit him to hire ushers sufficient to assist in the discharge of the mechanical part of the business. Besides, whatever appearance the house and garden may make, the children do not enjoy the comforts of either, for they are continually reminded by irksome restrictions that they are not at home, and the staterooms, gardens, etc., must be kept in order for the recreation of the parents, who, of a Sunday, visit the school, and are impressed by the very parade that renders the situation of their children uncomfortable. With what disgust have I heard sensible women, for girls are more restrained and cowed than boys, speak of the wearisome confinement which they endured at school. Not allowed, perhaps, to step out of one broad walk in a superb garden, and obliged to pace with steady deportment, stupidly backwards and forwards, holding up their heads and turning out their toes, with shoulders braced back, instead of bounding as nature directs to complete her own design in the various attitudes so conducive to health. The pure animal spirits, which make both mind and body shoot out and unfold the tender blossoms of hope, are turned sour, and vented in vain wishes, or pert repinings, that contract the faculties and spoil the temper, else they mount to the brain, and, sharpening the understanding before it gains proportionable strength, produce that pitiful cunning which disgracefully characterizes the female mind, and, I fear, will ever characterize it whilst women remain the slaves of power. The little respect which the male world pay to chastity is, I am persuaded, the grand source of many of the physical and moral evils that torment mankind, as well as of the vices and follies that degrade and destroy women. Yet, at school, boys infallibly lose that decent bashfulness which might have ripened into modesty at home. I have already animadverted on the bad habits which females acquire when they are shut up together, and I think that the observation may fairly be extended to the other sex, till the natural inference is drawn, which I have had in view throughout, that to improve both sexes they ought, not only in private families, but in public schools, to be educated together. If marriage be the cement of society, mankind should all be educated after the same model, or the intercourse of the sexes will never deserve the name of fellowship, nor will women ever fulfill the peculiar duties of their sex, till they become enlightened citizens, till they become free, by being enabled to earn their own subsistence independent of men. In the same manner, I mean, to prevent misconstruction, as one man is independent of another. Nay, marriage will never be held sacred till women, by being brought up with men, are prepared to be their companions rather than their mistresses, for the mean doublings of cunning will ever render them contemptible, whilst oppression renders them timid. So convinced am I of this truth, that I will venture to predict that virtue will never prevail in society till the virtues of both sexes are founded on reason, and till the affection common to both are allowed to gain their due strength by the discharge of mutual duties. Were boys and girls permitted to pursue the same studies together, those graceful decencies might early be inculcated which produce modesty, without those sexual distinctions that taint the mind. Lessons of politeness and that formulary of decorum which treads on the heels of falsehood would be rendered useless by habitual propriety of behavior. Not, indeed, put on for visitors like the courtly robe of politeness, but the sober effect of cleanliness of mind. Would not this simple elegance of sincerity be a chaste homage paid to domestic affections, far surpassing the meretricious compliments that shine with false lustre in the heartless intercourse of fashionable life? But till more understanding preponderate in society, there will ever be a want of heart and taste, and the harlot's rouge will supply the place of that celestial suffusion which only virtuous affections can give to the face. Gallantry, and what is called love, may subsist without simplicity of character, but the main pillars of friendship are respect and confidence. Esteem is never founded on it cannot tell what. A taste for the fine arts requires great cultivation, but not more than a taste for the virtuous affections, and both suppose that enlargement of mind which opens so many sources of mental pleasure. Why do people hurry to noisy scenes and crowded circles? I should answer, because they want activity of mind, because they have not cherished the virtues of the heart. They only, therefore, see and feel in the gross, and continually pine after variety, finding everything that is simple insipid. This argument may be carried further than philosophers are aware of, for if nature destined woman, in particular, for the discharge of domestic duties, she made her susceptible of the attached affections in a great degree. Now, women are notoriously fond of pleasure, and naturally must be so, according to my definition, because they cannot enter into the minutiae of domestic taste, lacking judgment, the foundation of all taste. For the understanding, in spite of sensual cavillers, reserves to itself the privilege of conveying pure joy to the heart. With what a languid yawn have I seen an admirable poem thrown down, that a man of true taste returns to again and again with rapture, and whilst melody has almost superseded respiration, a lady has asked me where I bought my gown. I have seen also an eye glanced coldly over a most exquisite picture, rest sparkling with pleasure on a caricature rudely sketched, and whilst some terrific feature in nature has spread a sublime stillness through my body, I have been desired to observe the pretty tricks of a lap-dog, that my perverse fate forced me to travel with. Is it surprising that such a tasteless being should rather caress this dog than her children, or that she should prefer the rant of flattery to the simple accents of sincerity? To illustrate this remark, I must be allowed to observe that men of the first genius and most cultivated minds have appeared to have the highest relish for the simple beauties of nature, and they must have forcibly felt, what they have so well described, the charm which natural affections and unsophisticated feelings spread round the human character. It is this power of looking into the heart, and responsively vibrating with each emotion, that enables the poet to personify each passion, and the painter to sketch with a pencil of fire. True taste is ever the work of the understanding employed in observing natural effects, and until women have more understanding, it is vain to expect them to possess domestic taste. Their lively senses will ever be at work to harden their hearts, and the emotions struck out of them will continue to be vivid and transitory, unless a proper education stores their minds with knowledge. It is the want of domestic taste, and not the acquirement of knowledge, that takes women out of their families and tears the smiling babe from the breast that ought to afford it nourishment. Women have been allowed to remain in ignorance and slavish dependence many, very many years, and still we hear of nothing but their fondness of pleasure and sway, their preference of rakes and soldiers, their childish attachment to toys, and the vanity that makes them value accomplishments more than virtues. History brings forward a fearful catalogue of the crimes which their cunning has produced, when the weak slaves have had sufficient address to overreach their masters. In France, and in how many other countries, have men been the luxurious despots, and women the crafty ministers? Does this prove that ignorance and dependence domesticate them? Is not their folly the byword of the libertines who relax in their society? And do not men of sense continually lament that an immoderate fondness for dress and dissipation carries the mother of a family forever from home? Their hearts have not been debauched by knowledge, nor their minds led astray by scientific pursuits. Yet they do not fulfill the peculiar duties which as women they are called upon by nature to fulfill. On the contrary, the state of warfare which subsists between the sexes makes them employ those wiles that frustrate the more open designs of force. When, therefore, I call women slaves, I mean in a political and civil sense, for indirectly they obtain too much power, and are debased by their exertions to obtain illicit sway. Let an enlightened nation, then, try what effect reason would have to bring them back to nature and their duty, and allowing them to share the advantages of education and government with man, see whether they will become better as they grow wiser and become free. They cannot be injured by the experiment, for it is not in the power of man to render them more insignificant than they are at present. To render this practicable, day schools for particular ages should be established by government, in which boys and girls might be educated together. The school for the younger children from 5 to 9 years of age ought to be absolutely free and open to all classes. Footnote. Treating this part of the subject, I have borrowed some hints from a very sensible pamphlet written by the late Bishop of Autun on public education. A sufficient number of masters should also be employed by a select committee in each parish, to whom any complaint of negligence, etc., might be made, if signed by 6 of the children's parents. Ushers would then be unnecessary, for I believe experience will ever prove that this kind of subordinate authority is particularly injurious to the morals of youth. What, indeed, can tend to deprave the character more than outward submission and inward contempt? Yet, how can boys be expected to treat an usher with respect, when the master seems to consider him in the light of a servant, and almost to countenance the ridicule which becomes the chief amusement of the boys during the play hours? But nothing of this kind could occur in an elementary day school, where boys and girls, the rich and poor, should meet together. And to prevent any of the distinctions of vanity, they should be dressed alike, and all obliged to submit to the same discipline, or leave the school. The schoolroom ought to be surrounded by a large piece of ground, in which the children might usefully exercise. For at this age they should not be confined to any sedentary employment for more than an hour at a time. But these relaxations might all be rendered a part of elementary education, for many things improve and amuse the senses when introduced as a kind of show, to the principles of which, dryly laid down, children would turn a deaf ear. For instance, botany, mechanics, and astronomy. Reading, writing, and arithmetic, natural history, and some simple experiments in natural philosophy might fill up the day. But these pursuits should never encroach on gymnastic plays in the open air. The elements of religion, history, the history of man and politics, might also be taught by conversations in the Socratic form. After the age of 9, girls and boys, intended for domestic employments or mechanical trades, ought to be removed to other schools and receive instruction in some measure appropriated to the destination of each individual, the 2 sexes being still together in the morning, but in the afternoon the girls should attend a school where plain work, mantua making, millinery, etc., would be their employment. The young people of superior abilities or fortune might now be taught in another school the dead and living languages, the elements of science, and continue the study of history and politics on a more extensive scale, which would not exclude polite literature. Girls and boys still together, I hear some readers ask? Yes, and I should not fear any other consequence than that some early attachment might take place, which, whilst it had the best effect on the moral character of the young people, might not perfectly agree with the views of the parents, for it will be a long time, I fear, before the world is so enlightened that parents, only anxious to render their children virtuous, will let them choose companions for life themselves. Besides, this would be a sure way to promote early marriages, and from early marriages the most salutary physical and moral effects naturally flow. What a different character does a married citizen assume from the selfish coxcomb, who lives but for himself, and who is often afraid to marry, lest he should not be able to live in a certain style. Great emergencies excepted, which would rarely occur in a society of which equality was the basis, a man could only be prepared to discharge the duties of public life by the habitual practice of those inferior ones which form the man. In this plan of education, the constitution of boys would not be ruined by the early debaucheries which now make men so selfish, nor girls rendered weak and vain by indolence and frivolous pursuits. But I presuppose that such a degree of equality should be established between the sexes as would shut out gallantry and coquetry, yet allow friendship and love to temper the heart for the discharge of higher duties. These would be schools of morality, and the happiness of man allowed to flow from the pure springs of duty and affection. What advances might not the human mind make? Society can only be happy and free in proportion as it is virtuous. But the present distinctions established in society corrode all private and blast all public virtue. I have already inveighed against the custom of confining girls to their needle and shutting them out from all political and civil employments, for by thus narrowing their minds they are rendered unfit to fulfill the peculiar duties which nature has assigned them. Only employed about the little incidents of the day, they necessarily grow up cunning. My very soul has often sickened at observing the sly tricks practised by women to gain some foolish thing on which their silly hearts were set. Not allowed to dispose of money, or call anything their own, they learn to turn the market penny, or, should a husband offend by staying from home, or give rise to some emotions of jealousy, a new gown, or any pretty bauble, smooths Juno's angry brow. But these littlenesses would not degrade their character if women were led to respect themselves, if political and moral subjects were open to them, and I will venture to affirm that this is the only way to make them properly attentive to their domestic duties. An active mind embraces the whole circle of its duties, and finds time enough for all. It is not, I assert, a bold attempt to emulate masculine virtues. It is not the enchantment of literary pursuits or the steady investigation of scientific subjects that lead women astray from duty. No, it is indolence and vanity, the love of pleasure and the love of sway, that will reign paramount in an empty mind. I say empty emphatically, because the education which women now receive scarcely deserves the name, for the little knowledge they are led to acquire during the important years of youth is merely relative to accomplishments, and accomplishments without a bottom, for unless the understanding be cultivated, superficial and monotonous is every grace. Like the charms of a made-up face, they only strike the senses in a crowd, but at home, wanting mind, they want variety. The consequence is obvious. In gay scenes of dissipation, we meet the artificial mind and face, for those who fly from solitude, dread, next to solitude, the domestic circle. Not having it in their power to amuse or interest, they feel their own insignificance, or find nothing to amuse or interest themselves. Besides, what can be more indelicate than a girl's coming out in the fashionable world, which, in other words, is to bring to market a marriageable miss, whose person is taken from one public place to another, richly caparisoned. Yet, mixing in the giddy circle under restraint, these butterflies long to flutter at large, for the first affection of their souls is their own persons, to which their attention has been called with the most sedulous care, whilst they were preparing for the period that decides their fate for life. Instead of pursuing this idle routine, sighing for the tasteless show and heartless state, with what dignity would the youths of both sexes form attachments in the schools that I have cursorily pointed out, in which, as life advanced, dancing, music, and drawing might be admitted as relaxations, for at these schools young people of fortune ought to remain more or less till they were of age. Those who were designed for particular professions might attend 3 or 4 mornings in the week the schools appropriated for their immediate instruction. I only drop these observations at present as hints, rather, indeed, as an outline of the plan, I mean, than a digested one. But I must add that I highly approve of one regulation mentioned in the pamphlet already alluded to, from the Bishop of Autun, that of making the children and youths independent of the masters respecting punishments. They should be tried by their peers, which would be an admirable method of fixing sound principles of justice in the mind, and might have the happiest effect on the temper, which is very early soured or irritated by tyranny, till it becomes peevishly cunning or ferociously overbearing. My imagination darts forward with benevolent fervor to greet these amiable and respectable groups, in spite of the sneering of cold hearts, who are at liberty to utter, with frigid self-importance, the damning epithet romantic, the force of which I shall endeavor to blunt by repeating the words of an eloquent moralist. I quote, "I know not whether the illusions of a truly humane heart, whose zeal renders everything easy, is not preferable to that rough and repulsing reason, which always finds in indifference for the public good the first obstacle to whatever would promote it." Close quote. I know that libertines will also exclaim that woman would be unsexed by acquiring strength of body and mind, and that beauty, soft, bewitching beauty, would no longer adorn the daughters of men. I am of a very different opinion, for I think that, on the contrary, we should then see dignified beauty and true grace, to produce which many powerful physical and moral causes would concur. Not relaxed beauty, it is true, nor the graces of helplessness, but such as appears to make us respect the human body as a majestic pile fit to receive a noble inhabitant in the relics of antiquity. I do not forget the popular opinion that the Grecian statues were not modeled after nature. I mean, not according to the proportions of a particular man, but that beautiful limbs and features were selected from various bodies to form an harmonious whole. This might, in some degree, be true. The fine ideal picture of an exalted imagination might be superior to the materials which the painter found in nature, and thus it might with propriety be termed rather the model of mankind than of a man. It was not, however, the mechanical selection of limbs and features, but the ebullition of an heated fancy that burst forth, and the fine senses and enlarged understanding of the artist selected the solid matter which he drew into this glowing focus. I observed that it was not mechanical, because a whole was produced, a model of that grand simplicity of those concurring energies which arrest our attention and command our reverence. For only insipid, lifeless beauty is produced by a servile copy of even beautiful nature. Yet, independent of these observations, I believe that the human form must have been far more beautiful than it is at present, because extreme indolence, barbarous ligatures, and many causes, which forcibly act on it in our luxurious state of society, did not retard its expansion or render it deformed. Exercise and cleanliness appear to be not only the surest means of preserving health, but of promoting beauty, the physical causes only considered. Yet this is not sufficient. Moral ones must concur, or beauty will be merely of that rustic kind which blooms on the innocent, wholesome countenances of some country people, whose minds have not been exercised. To render the person perfect, physical and moral beauty ought to be attained at the same time, each lending and receiving force by the combination. Judgment must reside on the brow, affection and fancy beam in the eye, and humanity curve the cheek, or vain as the sparkling of the finest eye, or the elegantly turned finish of the fairest features. While in every motion that displays the active limbs and well-knit joints, grace and modesty should appear. But this fair assemblage is not to be brought together by chance. It is the reward of exertions meant to support each other, for judgment can only be acquired by reflection, affection, and by the discharge of duties, and humanity by the exercise of compassion to every living creature. Humanity to animals should be particularly inculcated as a part of national education, for it is not at present one of our national virtues. Tenderness for their humble, dumb domestics amongst the lower class is oftener to be found in a savage than a civilized state, for civilization prevents that intercourse which creates affection in the rude hut or mud cabin, and leads uncultivated minds, who are only depraved by the refinements which prevail in society, where they are trodden under foot by the rich, to domineer over them, to revenge the insults that they are obliged to bear from their superiors. This habitual cruelty is first taught at school, where it is one of the rare sports of the boys to torment the miserable brutes that fall in their way. The transition, as they grow up from barbarity to brutes, to domestic tyranny over wives, children, and servants, is very easy. Justice, or even benevolence, will not be a powerful spring of action unless it extend to the whole creation. Nay, I believe that it may be delivered as an axiom that those who can see pain unmoved will soon learn to inflict it. The vulgar are swayed by present feelings and the habits which they have accidentally acquired. But on partial feelings much dependence cannot be placed, though they be just. For when they are not invigorated by reflection, custom weakens them till they are scarcely felt. The sympathies of our nature are strengthened by pondering cogitations, and deadened by thoughtless use. Macbeth's heart smote him more for one murder, the first, than for 100 subsequent ones, which were necessary to back it. But when I used the epithet vulgar, I did not mean to confine my remark to the poor, for partial humanity, founded on present sensations or whim, is quite as conspicuous, if not more so, amongst the rich. The lady who sheds tears for the bird starved in a snare, and execrates the devils in the shape of men who goad to madness the poor ox, or whip the patient ass, tottering under a burden above its strength, will, nevertheless, keep her coachman and horses whole hours waiting for her, when the sharp frost bites, or the rain beats against the well-closed windows, which do not admit a breath of air to tell her how roughly the wind blows without. And she who takes her dogs to bed, and nurses them with a parade of sensibility when sick, will suffer her babes to grow up crooked in a nursery. This illustration of my argument is drawn from a matter of fact. The woman whom I allude to was handsome, reckoned very handsome, by those who do not miss the mind when the face is plump and fair. But her understanding had not been led from female duties by literature, nor her innocence debauched by knowledge. No, she was quite feminine, according to the masculine acceptation of the word. And so far from loving these spoiled brutes that filled the place which her children ought to have occupied, she only lisped out a pretty mixture of French and English nonsense, to please the men who flocked round her. The wife, mother, and human creature were all swallowed up by the factitious character which an improper education and the selfish vanity of beauty had produced. I do not like to make a distinction without a difference, and I own that I have been as much disgusted by the fine lady who took her lap-dog to her bosom instead of her child, as by the ferocity of a man who, beating his horse, declared that he knew as well when he did wrong as a Christian. This brood of folly shows how mistaken they are who, if they allow women to leave their harems, do not cultivate their understanding, in order to plant virtues in their hearts. For had they sense, they might acquire that domestic taste which would lead them to love with reasonable subordination their whole family, from the husband to the house-dog, nor would they ever insult humanity in the person of the most menial servant by paying more attention to the comfort of a brute than to that of a fellow creature. My observations on national education are obviously hints, but I principally wish to enforce the necessity of educating the sexes together to perfect both, and of making children sleep at home, that they may learn to love home, yet to make private support, instead of smothering public affections, they should be sent to school to mix with a number of equals, for only by the jostlings of equality can we form a just opinion of ourselves. To render mankind more virtuous, and happier, of course, both sexes must act from the same principle. But how can that be expected when only one is allowed to see the reasonableness of it? To render also the social compact truly equitable, and in order to spread those enlightening principles which alone can meliorate the fate of man, women must be allowed to found their virtue on knowledge, which is scarcely possible unless they be educated by the same pursuits as men. For they are now made so inferior by ignorance and low desires as not to deserve to be ranked with them, or by the serpentine wrigglings of cunning they mount the tree of knowledge and only acquire sufficient to lead men astray. It is plain from the history of all nations that women cannot be confined to merely domestic pursuits, for they will not fulfill family duties unless their minds take a wider range, and whilst they are kept in ignorance, they become in the same proportion the slaves of pleasure as they are the slaves of man. Nor can they be shut out of great enterprises, though the narrowness of their minds often make them mar what they are unable to comprehend. The libertinism and even the virtues of superior men will always give women of some description great power over them, and these weak women, under the influence of childish passions and selfish vanity, will throw a false light over the objects which the very men view with their eyes, who ought to enlighten their judgment. Men of fancy, and those sanguine characters who mostly hold the helm of human affairs, in general, relax in the society of women. And certainly I need not cite, to the most superficial reader of history, the numerous examples of vice and oppression which the private intrigues of female favourites have produced, not to dwell on the mischief that naturally arises from the blundering interposition of well-meaning folly. For in the transactions of business it is much better to have to deal with a knave than a fool, because a knave adheres to some plan, and any plan of reason may be seen through much sooner than a sudden flight of folly. The power which vile and foolish women have had over wise men who possessed sensibility is notorious. I shall only mention one instance. Whoever drew a more exalted female character than Rousseau, though, in the lump, he constantly endeavoured to degrade the sex? And why was he thus anxious? Truly, to justify to himself the affection which weakness and virtue had made him cherish for that fool Teresa. He could not raise her to the common level of her sex, and therefore he laboured to bring woman down to hers. He found her a convenient, humble companion, and pride made him determined to find some superior virtues in the being whom he chose to live with. But did not her conduct during his life and after his death clearly show how grossly he was mistaken who called her a celestial innocent. Nay, in the bitterness of his heart he himself laments that when his bodily infirmities made him no longer treat her like a woman, she ceased to have an affection for him, and it was very natural that she should, for having so few sentiments in common, when the sexual tie was broken, what was to hold her? To hold her affection whose sensibility was confined to one sex, nay, to one man, it requires sense to turn sensibility into the broad channel of humanity. Many women have not mind enough to have an affection for a woman, or a friendship for a man. But the sexual weakness that makes woman depend on man for a subsistence produces a kind of cattish affection which leads a wife to purr about her husband as she would about any man who fed and caressed her. Men are, however, often gratified by this kind of fondness, which is confined in a beastly manner to themselves, but should they ever become more virtuous, they will wish to converse at their fireside with a friend, after they cease to play with a mistress. Besides, understanding is necessary to give variety and interest to sensual enjoyments, for low indeed in the intellectual scale is the mind that can continue to love when neither virtue nor sense give a human appearance to an animal appetite. But sense will always preponderate, and if women are not in general brought more on a level with men, some superior women, like the Greek courtesans, will assemble the men of abilities around them, and draw from their families many citizens, who would have stayed at home, had their wives had more sense, or the graces which result from the exercise of the understanding and fancy, the legitimate parents of taste. A woman of talents, if she be not absolutely ugly, will always obtain great power, raised by the weakness of her sex, and in proportion as men acquire virtue and delicacy, by the exertion of reason they will look for both in women, but they can only acquire them in the same way that men do. In France or Italy, have the women confined themselves to domestic life? Though they have not hitherto had a political existence, yet have they not illicitly had great sway, corrupting themselves and the men with whose passions they played? In short, in whatever light I view the subject, reason and experience convince me that the only method of leading women to fulfill their peculiar duties is to free them from all restraint by allowing them to participate in the inherent rights of mankind. Make them free, and they will quickly become wise and virtuous, as men become more so, for the improvement must be mutual, or the justice which one half of the human race are obliged to submit to, retorting on their oppressors, the virtue of man will be worm-eaten by the insect whom he keeps under his feet. Let men take their choice. Man and woman were made for each other, though not to become one being, and if they will not improve women, they will deprave them. I speak of the improvement and emancipation of the whole sex, for I know that the behavior of a few women, who by accident or following a strong bent of nature have acquired a portion of knowledge superior to that of the rest of their sex, has often been overbearing. But there have been instances of women who, attaining knowledge, have not discarded modesty, nor have they always appeared to pedantically despise the ignorance which they labored to disperse in their own minds. The exclamations, then, which any advice respecting female learning commonly produces, especially from pretty women, often arise from envy, when they chance to see that even the lustre of their eyes and the flippant sportiveness of refined coquetry will not always secure them attention during a whole evening, should a woman of a more cultivated understanding endeavor to give a rational turn to the conversation. The common source of consolation is that such women seldom get husbands. What arts have I not seen silly women use to interrupt by flirtation a very significant word to describe such a maneuver, a rational conversation which made the men forget that they were pretty women. But allowing what is very natural to man, that the possession of rare abilities is really calculated to excite overweening pride, disgusting in both men and women, in what a state of inferiority must the female faculties have rusted when such a small portion of knowledge as those women attained, who have been sneeringly termed learned women, could be singular, sufficiently so to puff up the possessor and excite envy in her contemporaries and some of the other sex. Nay, has not a little rationality exposed many women to the severest censure? I advert to well-known facts, for I have frequently heard women ridiculed and every little weakness exposed, only because they adopted the advice of some medical men, and deviated from the beaten track in their mode of treating their infants. I have actually heard this barbarous aversion to innovation carried still further, and a sensible woman stigmatized as an unnatural mother, who has thus been wisely solicitous to preserve the health of her children, when in the midst of her care she has lost one by some of the casualties of infancy which no prudence can ward off. Her acquaintance have observed that this was the consequence of new-fangled notions, the new-fangled notions of ease and cleanliness, and those who, pretending to experience, though they have long adhered to prejudices that have, according to the opinion of the most sagacious physicians, thinned the human race, almost rejoiced at the disaster that gave a kind of sanction to prescription. Indeed, if it were only on this account, the national education of women is of the utmost consequence. For what a number of human sacrifices are made to that Moloch, prejudice, and in how many ways are children destroyed by the lasciviousness of man. The want of natural affection in many women, who are drawn from their duty by the admiration of men and the ignorance of others, render the infancy of man a much more perilous state than that of brutes. Yet men are unwilling to place women in situations proper to enable them to acquire sufficient understanding to know how even to nurse their babes. So forcibly does this truth strike me, that I would rest the whole tendency of my reasoning upon it, for whatever tends to incapacitate the maternal character takes woman out of her sphere. But it is vain to expect the present race of weak mothers either to take that reasonable care of a child's body, which is necessary to lay the foundation of a good constitution, supposing that it do not suffer from the sins of its fathers, or to manage its temper so judiciously that the child will not have, as it grows up, to throw off all that its mother, its first instructor, directly or indirectly taught. And unless the mind have uncommon vigor, womanish follies will stick to the character throughout life. The weakness of the mother will be visited on the children. And while women are educated to rely on their husbands for judgment, this must ever be the consequence. For there is no improving an understanding by halves, nor can any being act wisely from imitation, because in every circumstance of life there is a kind of individuality which requires an exertion of judgment to modify general rules. The being who can think justly in one track will soon extend its intellectual empire, and she who has sufficient judgment to manage her children will not submit to right or wrong, to her husband, or patiently to the social laws which makes a nonentity of a wife. In public schools, women, to guard against the errors of ignorance, should be taught the elements of anatomy and medicine, not only to enable them to take proper care of their own health, but to make them rational nurses of their infants, parents, and husbands. For the bills of mortality are swelled by the blunders of self-willed old women, who give nostrums of their own without knowing anything of the human frame. It is likewise proper, only in a domestic view, to make women acquainted with the anatomy of the mind, by allowing the sexes to associate together in every pursuit, and by leading them to observe the progress of the human understanding in the improvement of the sciences and arts, never forgetting the science of morality, nor the study of the political history of mankind. A man has been termed a microcosm, and every family might also be called a state. States, it is true, have mostly been governed by arts that disgrace the character of man, and the want of a just constitution and equal laws have so perplexed the notions of the worldly wise that they more than question the reasonableness of contending for the rights of humanity. Thus morality, polluted in the national reservoir, sends off streams of vice to corrupt the constituent parts of the body politic. But should more noble, or rather more just, principles regulate the laws, which ought to be the government of society, and not those who execute them, duty might become the rule of private conduct. Besides, by the exercise of their bodies and minds, women would acquire that mental activity so necessary in the maternal character, united with the fortitude that distinguishes steadiness of conduct from the obstinate perverseness of weakness. For it is dangerous to advise the indolent to be steady, because they instantly become rigorous, and to save themselves trouble, punish with severity faults that the patient fortitude of reason might have prevented. But fortitude presupposes strength of mind. And is strength of mind to be acquired by indolent acquiescence? By asking advice instead of exerting the judgment? By obeying through fear instead of practicing the forbearance which we all stand in need of ourselves? The conclusion which I wish to draw is obvious. Make women rational creatures and free citizens, and they will quickly become good wives and mothers. That is, if men do not neglect the duties of husbands and fathers. Discussing the advantages which a public and private education combined, as I have sketched, might rationally be expected to produce, I have dwelt most on such as are particularly relative to the female world, because I think the female world oppressed. Yet the gangrene which the vices engendered by oppression have produced is not confined to the morbid part, but pervades society at large, so that when I wish to see my sex become more like moral agents, my heart bounds with the anticipation of the general diffusion of that sublime contentment which only morality can diffuse. End of Chapter 12 on National Education. Read by Denny Sayers in Modesto, California for LibriVox, Spring 2006.